to vocalize your questions. So we are, okay, and we're recording. Excellent. All right, so welcome to the book launch of the second edition of the Education, International Development and Introduction text. If you're familiar with the field, you realize how central this is as a textbook in this area. So I'm really thrilled today to have editors and chapter authors here to share the recent release of this book. We're hosting here as part of the Comparative Education and International Development community at Meera House, specifically our research group. We'd encourage you to share about the event or connect with us on our Twitter feed at Meera House CID. So today, we're going to start with a brief editor introduction. We'll have chapter summaries from some select chapters, specifically some of the new authors on this edition. We'll have a discussant, and then an open question and answer time. So I want to start by inviting one of our two editors to share a little bit. So this is the second edition that Tristan, McCowan, and Elaine Unterhalter have been working together on this, and we're lucky to have Tristan here today. He's a professor of international education at the Institute of Education, University College London. So Tristan, I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about the book.
Great, thank you very much, Will. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for organising this event at the University of Edinburgh. It's really great to be here with you. Elaine will be joining us any minute, but my first comment really is to say how wonderful it has been working for a second time with Elaine on this volume as co-editor. We worked together on this. It's always wonderful working with her, and particularly the amazing panorama that she has over the field, this very broad view across all of the different aspects of this extremely diverse field of study, its different contexts and multiple disciplines, and drawing everything from arts to natural sciences and the political sphere. So that's been wonderful. I'm just going to make some very brief remarks on the purpose of the book and what's different from the first edition, and then we'll hear the important stuff from the chapter authors who will say a little about what they've written. So the original purpose of this book is to provide a synthesis of this very complex field of education and international development by looking at particular aspects of it, and partly to provide the essentials for someone who's wanting to gain familiarity with all these diverse aspects, but also to provide an open. So we see this very much as a rather than providing a final word on a topic, as to providing a set of pointers to further exploration. So for people wanting to open up these areas for further research or work and stuff. So both essentials and the opening up. And with an audience of combined of graduate students in this field, general researchers on education who are looking for an introduction to international development topics, international development professionals and researchers who want an introduction to education and so forth, and combinations of those. Brings together, of course, these areas of education very broadly understood, all the different levels of formal education as well as non-formal, informal learning. And this sphere of international development, which primarily includes what is, of course, a conflation of very diverse contexts across different continents, with all their significant political, economic, and cultural diversity, but bound together in what hangs together, at least in some form, as a space of international development with its agencies, its policies, its ideologies, and so forth, its dominant forms of organization in relation to economic, political, and economic spheres. And also a sphere of political mobilization. This aspect of grassroots, of global South movements, of decolonization, movements for global justice, and so forth, are gathering strength. Now, the first edition was published in 2015 and was written in the couple of years prior to that. And of course, a lot has happened since then. So we were needing a second edition to address some of those key changes in different spheres. The SDGs, of course, which were launched in 2015, came at the time the book was published, so we had to engage with that agenda. A range of political changes in this tumultuous period with Trump, Brexit, the rise of political movements, grassroots movements, Black Lives Matter, and so forth. And then, of course, COVID 2020. So there have been some very significant changes in political configurations that have affected education. And of course, in educational movements, and Roads Must Fall and movements for decolonization have gathered ground. And we've tried to reflect that as far as possible in the updates to the different chapters. So all of the chapters in the book have had updates, but we've also included some new chapters. So 4 completely new ones, 3 which will be discussed in this launch. So I won't say very much about these. We'll be hearing a lot, and those are about learning metrics, Will Smith and Aaron Benevot, privatization, Joanna Harma, and sustainable development, Meera, Tiwari. But also one that, because unfortunately we weren't able to have represented today because of difficulties with people's commitments and time zones. But that was the chapter on decolonization by Lorato Coscioli and Pablo Del Monte. It's always a very difficult decision about what you treat transversally and what you give a discrete area to. So topics such as gender, health, technology, disability, pedagogy, we made a call to treat them across all of the chapters rather than having a discrete space for them. But maybe we've made the wrong call on some of those. So it'll be interesting to hear your views. It's a difficult one to know what you treat in different ways in a book like this, because all of those topics are, of course, of I'm really looking forward to hearing reactions and comments, and we hope you like the version. It's wonderful to be here with the different speakers, some of our chapter authors. There are many others who couldn't be with us here. We've actually got 26 authors in this collection. It's been amazing working all different world regions, different areas of research, different disciplines and levels of the education system. So thank you to all of you for making this possible. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Tristan, for getting us started and for inviting us to participate and sharing your time today. So we're going to go through 4 chapter summaries. These will be brief summaries. We'd encourage you to actually take a look at the book. It's available online. It's affordable for a textbook, and it's available, I think, in most libraries, or will be soon, university libraries. So I'm going to get things started with my look at the chapters, and then we'll continue to look at the 4 chapters we have here. Hopefully Elaine will be able to join us shortly. If not, we'll go ahead and go to Joanna and then Meera's chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thanks everybody for joining. I don't think I actually introduced myself. I'm Will Smith at the University of Edinburgh. I'm the coordinator for the Comparative Education International Development Community here. And this is a chapter I wrote with Aaron Benevot at SUNY Albany. So looking at quality education and global learning metrics. So the motivation for this chapter is SDG 4. So both Aaron and I really started our collaboration when we were both working on UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report at the transition into SDG 4. And people started talking about SDG 4 as a quality turn in education. And we started seeing all this stuff on quality really being institutionalized in the discourse. So we're moving towards quality education. We have inclusive quality education. There was a noticeable shift from the Millennium Development Goals, which was really a focus on access, specifically to primary education, to, again, quality and learning. we started wondering, is this a real quality term? Quality is what would be considered an equivocal term where everybody thinks it's important and accepts it, but we don't actually know what it is. So it's everywhere in the literature, but not really well defined. So this chapter starts with how is quality being understood? And then talks about, well, whose quality is being recognized and acted upon? And then talks about global learning metrics and the emergence of strong global learning metrics in the SDG era as an example of how quality is really being understood in the SDG 4 era. So I'm going to focus mainly on the conversations around quality here. When we conceptualize quality, there are kind of a range of key considerations. So quality does not mean the same thing to everybody. And when we look at the definitions, quality, there are some considerations that we need to understand when we're exploring how quality is conceptualized. The first is if people are thinking about quality as a universal phenomenon or whether quality is really locally defined. Can we measure and compare quality the same way in each country, in each region? Is it universal? Is there a single metric we can say, yes, this is good quality education, or does it really differ depending on the local needs and aims? The second is when we're looking at quality, are we looking at all of the education system, or are we really looking at a partial understanding of education? Right, so this might mean we're just focusing on outcomes, but we're not really interested in inputs. And so a certain part of the education system has been identified as this is quality, and we kind of forget about the rest. The third main consideration we identify is this idea of, is quality only concerned with formal schooling? Or when we talk about quality education, are we also interested in other ways of learning, other forms of schooling? That's especially important when we think about SDGs and the lifelong learning perspective. So much learning happens outside of formal schooling. Are we considering that when we're thinking about education quality? A couple of additional concerns we thought about was quality education differs when we think about different levels of education. We think, if somebody asks you what is a good quality higher education, that's much different than we talk about primary, we talk about early childhood. So we need to recognize that nuance, that quality is defined and looks different when we look at different levels of education. It also might be different when we think about different types of education. Secondly, how does time and the desired aim of education shape quality? If education is about long-term transformation, is that included in a way we consider quality education versus short-term gains? And finally, does how we measure quality change how we define quality? So these are some of the ways we're thinking about, is SDG 4 really a quality turn? And if it's a quality turn, whose quality is represented? So recognizing that definitions are not apolitical, that they're embedded into different ideological perspectives, the chapter looks at two dominant ideological perspectives in education and tries to recognize the differences in those considerations that we just talked about. So, and you should be familiar with these. So if we think about a human capital perspective versus a humanistic perspective on education. So we know human capital sees education as an investment, where humanistic often sees education as a human right. And their view of education drives how they see quality in education. So for human capital, education quality is often universally defined. We're looking for comparisons across countries and being able to do that type of, I guess, single or maybe multiple metric, but something that we can say this is quality education in this context compared to quality education in this context. It tends to have a very partial understanding of what quality education is, focusing on outputs and outcomes. Maybe these are test scores, maybe this is economic growth. And it tends to focus on formal academic knowledge, where those are often measured through assessments. So a humanistic takes a much broader approach, right? So it might say that, yes, rights are universally defined, but locally, I guess, adapted, where we've got both a universal understanding and a local definition of quality. And quality then changes to meet the needs of the local community. It tends to be more holistic, and a humanistic approach, something like teachers, takes a much higher status than in a human capital approach. So in a humanistic approach, inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes are all considered when we're trying to understand quality education. And it recognizes all forms of education. So formal in addition to informal and non-formal learning. So briefly trying to figure out, well, what does SDG 4 look like? So there's a lot of good consultation going into the making of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Jordan Du, who was key at UNESCO's headquarters in the SDGs, talked about this is one of the most inclusive consultations in UNESCO and UN history. And with all those different parties coming together, you saw competing camps starting to develop. And so Elaine's work in 2019 on the many meanings of quality does a great job with this. So where they see two camps really competing in the creation of SDG 4, meetings and outputs that had more diverse contingencies. So amongst these key meetings that were inputting into the creation of SDG 4, those that had more diversity, that included civil society or included other actors from the Education for All era, tend to emphasize a more humanistic view of quality. Where those that had limited participation, mainly with international organizations and government, emphasized a more human capital view of quality. And at the end, we argue that human capitals emerged as a dominant view of quality. So why is that? In other work I do with Christopher Johnston, we try to explain this a little more. One is, do we see civil society fatigue? So there's huge buildup and lots of effort from civil society to make sure that this humanistic, rights-based, broad agenda in SDG 4 was included. And when we look at the targets, we look at the overall goals, we see that reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. When we look at the 8 key meetings leading up to SDG 4, really civil society's voice comes through very clearly in 6 of those 8 meetings. The second reason why human capital might have emerged as the dominant view of quality is through the operationalization process in the creation of indicators. So as we quantify the participation, that diverse participation ended up shrinking to really UIS and 27 national statistical offices creating indicators. And a lot of individuals, including Kenneth King, have done a good job of recognizing that there's a huge disparity between the optimism of the targets and the narrow focus of the indicators. And the third reason is really the investment and focus that SDG 4.11 is getting. So this is the global indicator for SDG 4.1 that talks about proficiency in math and literacy 3 times across an individual's schooling. So that's why we think it's happening. Some of the evidence that demonstrates that human capital has really taken over and captured the idea of quality for SDG 4. First is this highlighting of narrow global indicators in global reports and voluntary national reviews. So global indicators have narrowed from the targets. They tend to be more human capital focused mainly on outcomes. You can talk about it as an instrumentalist or econometric focus in education. And we expected that to be true for the global reports. But when you look at voluntary national reviews, and countries are encouraged to provide more context and maybe adopt national indicators to the SDGs, we actually see very little of that. And there's still this focus on global indicators only. We have the prominence of the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning. This is a subgroup within UIS that's focusing on creating indicators for all SDG targets that include learning, but within GAML, there's really an emphasis on SDG 4.1.1. So we see large investments in GAML by by organizations like DFAT in Australia or the FCDO in the UK or the Hewlett Foundation. But within GAML, even though it's supposed to cover multiple SDG targets, it really only focuses on SDG 4.1.1. And we can see that because this indicator has elevated from a tier 3 indicator, which means that we're really have no idea how to measure it, to a tier 1, where other indicators like SDG 4.7.1, which is a more humanistic indicator, has really never moved in its development from tier 3. We also can look at GAML's results framework and say, basically across the 5 or 6 goals that GAML looks at, 2 out of every 3 parts of that results framework focus on SDG 4.1.1. So finally, recognizing that human capital is a focus, global learning metrics, and SDG 4.1.1 as a global learning metric becomes the epitome of quality. And just to situate this within COVID era, we see this a lot in our news, really associated with learning loss. So in learning loss measured by global learning metrics, whether it's SDG 4.1.1 and UIS's efforts there, or by the learning poverty indicator put forth by the World Bank, we see those quantified to quality and the ability to respond or build back better as a way to evaluate quality in education. And we see these things, quality, fairly simply identified as, test scores, assessments, or even in these areas, and these are 2 separate analyses, lifetime learning loss. So once again, a very human capital instrumentalist view of quality. All right, so that's it for me. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'm happy to have any questions in the chat box. Yeah, and thanks for being here. Okay, so next up, yeah. So Elaine, welcome.
Hi, Will. I'm just slightly getting my breath and sorry to be late. Could I go after
Yeah, you
Joanna?
can go later. That sounds fine.
Thank you.
No problem. So welcome, Joanna. Then we're going to let you go ahead and go first. So Joanna Harma does a lot of different things. We are lucky to have her here over the last year at the University of Edinburgh, working in the CID program. She has a great chapter on de facto and by design privatization of education in developing countries. So Joanna, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over.
Thanks, Will. So I'm going to keep trying to make India school research and so
Joanna, we're having some technical issues. It looks like that's not just me, Stephanie. You're coming through, but you're coming through, yeah, as Stephanie talks about, a little wonky. Do you want to try again? Or we can come back to you a little later. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, sorry. Is there any chance I go after someone else? I might try and move my location if my connection is better.
Yeah, Joanna,
Will, do you want me to go next while Joanna tries to sort out?
Yeah, let's do that, Elaine. And Joanna, if you've got an alternative, you can go ahead and message me in the chat while we're getting everything sorted.
Yeah.
So, excellent. Sorry about that. So thanks, Elaine, for joining. For those of you who don't know Elaine, she's one of the editors here. We already had some good comments on Elaine from Tristan in his introduction, but Elaine is going to be talking about her chapter on addressing intersecting inequalities in education. So thanks, Elaine, for joining, and over to you.
Thanks, Will, and thanks to Tristan for the collaboration on the book, to all the authors, some of whom I can see on the call, and Will for organizing this launch. It's really great to be able to talk about some of the ideas and get feedback. This chapter on intersecting inequalities is a chapter that I rewrote from the first edition of the book, and I substantially revisited some of the ideas about inequality that had been in the first version, in the first edition, because I felt that in the first edition, the discussion had not really taken on board some of the dimensions of intersectionality, which is been such a contribution to how we think about inequality. And I wanted to reflect the considerable work that had been done in 5 years, 5 or 6 years, on thinking about inequality. What I do in the chapter is I try to draw out firstly, I should say that the work on inequality that I'm drawing on, a number of people on this call have contributed to, Maria, Tristan, those are just some of the names I'm seeing, Meera, as I'm seeing just on my screen. What I do in the chapter is try to pull out why inequality matters and try and say that there are some inequalities that don't matter, that they're just, no social consequences flow from, in some contexts, people's size, the color of their eyes, the color of their hair, but other inequalities matter a great deal, and they matter hugely in education, and they matter, and that matters hugely both in how one accesses education, how the processes that one experiences in education, and what comes out of that education. And I identify 5 forms of inequality in the chapter, and kind of try and link some of these with some metaphors about how to think of these in relation to education. The first form of inequality I identify as what I call vertical inequality. And that's, I think, the most common one, and the form in which most metrics of inequality work. They work with an idea of inequality of how much education, how much money, how many marks, how much have, so that vertical inequality, which is associated with class inequalities, it's associated with gender inequalities, it's associated with race and caste inequalities in different societies, but that one that sees education as little bundles, and you cross a line of having, and the World Bank now has its human capital index, and it continues to see education as crossing a particular line, and what Will was saying about quality, that particular version of quality is implicated in that human capital version of quality is implicated in that notion that inequality, the vertical inequalities, is that different people cross the line at different places. You just have different amounts. And I contrast that with horizontal inequalities, inequalities of deeply held, racialized, gendered inequalities that are carried over generations, born on people's body. You can never escape these inequalities, these horizontal inequalities, because the hatreds that people hold towards you are so deep. They can be very deep in cultures, very deep in language, very deep often in what are referred to as unconscious biases. And I think that those horizontal inequalities, which can explain for, for example, why teachers assume girls are bad at maths and boys don't want to read, those kinds of biases associated with horizontal inequalities, they connect into a range of other social processes. And I've used the metaphor of inequality associated with a net. I then identify a third kind of inequalities, which draws on the literature of the capability approach. And I talk about these as process inequalities. And I think the key thing in process inequalities is looking at the connection of structure and agency. I mean, in the capability approach, it's unequal processes associated with the sharing of information, the conversion of capabilities into functionings, the unequal processes associated with conversion factors. All of those are what the capability approach draws our attention to. And it's by seeking to change that mixture of process inequalities that you again develop a very wide range of actions around addressing inequalities. I had used the metaphor of thinking about equality as a fuel that could drive people out of poverty. And although the fuel can wanting to draw out the two-sidedness, but yeah, I don't think that metaphor works very well in relation to process inequalities. I also identify intersecting inequalities, and the work that I did with Maria Balsera and Lindsay Robinson for UNESCO on intersecting inequalities. We looked at gender and intersecting inequalities. I think we developed a very nice typology of three different kinds of ways of thinking about intersectionality as descriptive, discursive, and institutional. And then the fifth form of inequality associated with education I identify is the one that UNDP had identified distinguishing between complex and simple inequalities. I think for the process of the book and the way in which we're trying in the book to connect research, policy, and practice, this chapter does a lot of kind of conceptual ground clearing. It also, I think, looks at some of the metrics that have been used around inequalities. And I think the ways that horizontal inequalities tend to be treated as vertical inequalities is a real problem with one of the directions that education policy and practice is going down a route that looks for silver bullets and that just looks for packaging little bits of education without addressing the socioeconomic inequalities and political inequalities that surround it. That work on building all the other kinds of equality is a huge project. And you know, I would dearly wish if there was a third edition of the book, there wouldn't have to be a chapter on inequality. But I hope, you know, future work can try to develop and deepen our insight in what we can do to build equalities. So thanks very much, Will.
Excellent. Thank you, Elaine. For that, I want to encourage people, if you've got questions on the chapter summaries as we're going through, please do add them to the chat box. Now I've got a message from Joanna that she thinks she's all sorted out. So I want to invite Joanna Harma back to share out on her chapter on de facto and by design privatization of education. So Joanna, let's give it a shot.
Hi, am I audible now?
That is much better. Yes.
Great. So I moved location. I had to come out of my room. I'm on a working farm, so there's all kinds of stuff going on right next to me, literally right next to me. So I'm going to try and power through this. So yeah, so I have these private schools in India. I spent half my years here. And I've studied this topic of mostly the low-fee private schools targeting relatively poor people in developing countries. I've studied it in about 9 African countries and here in India. And so my chapter is basically to give a review of the topics. First, I talk about defining the different types of privatization and hint at the myriad ways in which private sector actors have become involved in education. indicating that there's a long history of public-private partnerships in between like church schools that were some of the first schools in Africa, many African countries, for example, which have become aided by governments, and then right through to the current era where governments are entering into different types of public partnerships with schools, private schools. The word privatization tends to conjure up
Joanna, we just lost you entirely. We might have lost her from the call, actually.
Could I suggest that Joanna can mute her video but keep the sound, because that way the signal then manages to come through better.
Yeah, I'll stop my video. Can you hear now?
So, Joanna, are you back? Yeah,
I think I'm back.
Okay. Yeah, so as a couple of people have suggested, maybe you can keep your video off and try to continue.
Yeah, I turned it off. So I'll try and be quite quick. To government services being turned into private. The title, de facto, hints at the fact, in exasperation with failing government schools, very often at the primary level, but also lack of at all at the pre-primary level, and increasingly at secondary level as well. People are basically on the government system to go to these private provision, private options, which may or may not be government recognized, regulated by the government, etc. So I go through a section on the theory of choice and market competition. Going
Joanna, I think we lost your audio.
I'm sorry about this. Yeah, I'm sorry about this. I think it's me here. I thought it was going to work better than this. And so I have sections on low-fee private schooling in developing countries, what the evidence that exists tells about affordability, accessibility, the quality of these schools, and the levels of equity or yeah, I'm sorry. This is probably just more tedious than it's worth.
Yeah, Joanna, maybe you can give a couple of summary thoughts in the chat, if you have access to the chat. But I think, yeah, it's probably good to move on. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry about that as well. Poor internet here. Yeah, suddenly my screen has come back, so it seems like the strength has gotten a bit quicker. So I mean, yeah, my key takeaway would be that that things have moved towards looking to low-fee private schools in public-private partnership and large chains. And I look at why that's probably not a great solution. The PPPs tending not to reach the poorest, as evidence from the Pakistan PPPs have shown, and the fact that low-fee private schools
Joanna, I think we just lost you at the end. Yeah. So let's go ahead and move on. I apologize for to Joanna and others for the challenges with the internet. But I'd like to now move on to our last chapter summary and welcome Meera Tiwari, whose chapter 18 is on education, environmental crisis, and sustainability. So another one of our new chapters for this volume. So Meera, I've got your slides and I'll go ahead and move through them. Just give me the nudge on where I should go next.
Great, thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to thank Elaine for inviting me to do this new chapter. We can all agree that this is very timely and extremely relevant. I've worked with Elaine on various other projects, but collaborating on a book was absolutely enjoyable. Thank you so much. And thank you also, Tristan, also for being so patient while I tried to do the various iterations amidst term 1 full teaching and also online teaching, and that was all last year within the COVID period. So thank you all. I hope this chapter has achieved what it was intended to do. So I've put just some pictures, and some of them are from my fieldwork, in fact 3 of them. And I thought I'll just, although this is not covered directly in the chapter, this is something I picked when Tristan was saying these are set of pointers helping people to explore further. And there's definitely a lot that can be explored, taken further from this chapter. But the picture on the right, the little capture on the right is very telling. It's this proportion of women on the COP26 leadership team. There was just 4 out of 17. And then the picture on the sort of the diagonal picture, that just actually reinforces, that draws attention to the research that climate volatilities, climate adverse impacts are experienced most by women. So this is quite a telling picture, I thought, and I thought I'll put it there. So different forms, and different chapters have alluded to formal education, non-formal. You can see what is happening in these pictures that I've captured in my field works. Some are from rural India. The one in the middle is from rural Tanzania. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the driver for this chapter really was to draw attention to the relationships between education, environmental volatilities, and actually it should be sustainability. Sorry about the typo. So it should be so trying to get this relation and capture the state of play, where we are, what has happened in the last maybe 30, 40 years, etc. So that was the driver. And so I have, in much of the chapter, I've tried to capture how it started during the 70s, perhaps in a scattered way during the 1960s, moving, and how in each decade there were warnings, there were sort of alert signals, and which cohorts, communities were engaging. I also draw attention to perhaps the missed opportunities in the education policy that didn't go beyond engaging with those already interested in the topic or talking to the converted. We didn't go engaging the very young, the elderly, or those beyond those interested cohorts. And so the chapter begins with this sort of signal, or asking a question: have we missed some opportunities? Because the environmental crisis, the alerts to environmental crisis have been, if you see, Club of Rome from the Meadows et al. Publication in 1972. This is the Brundtland report of 1987, the Earth Summit in 1992, and of course then the MDG focus in 2000. And just some of the figures that I talk about in the chapter is about we at this point, if we don't do anything, or if we continue how we are moving forward with the carbon emissions, our lifestyles, our values, we then 30%, 20 to 30% of the species are endangered. And this is the IPCC report 2014. There is an update. The next report has come out, but this data remains. This is confirmed and reinforced. And all the changes that are happening, that this is both affecting the developing countries and the developed countries. So this is something we are all in it together. So the sooner we engage with this, and the chapter draws attention to it. So we can say that habitat loss, livelihoods, food insecurity is going to be in developing countries, but air pollution, premature deaths, we are all this is quite prevalent in the developed countries as well. So I then ask this question about whether there is a need now to put more effort in reimagining the intricate connections about how we live, our value systems, how our aspirations, how we achieve them, and what we do to understand the problems of people living in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. And this is something I've put in Kate Roffert's, I refer to this, the Donut Economics, the book explains that in great detail, but I've used this figure to unpack the discourse on the planetary boundaries. So this is bringing in, the purpose of this was to show that it is possible. It is possible to live in that green area and actually embrace the sustainable development paradigm, embrace sustainability, lifestyle, sustainable lifestyles, green responsibility. It is possible. And so I thought drawing in the way it has been explained is a powerful tool in providing some hope. On the right side, I have alluded to some of this data that much of it is being felt in the developing countries. But what I talk about also is that where is this coming from? So what has caused the global crisis, the environmental crisis where we are? So there is there's a section on that engages with the literature on what are carbon emissions, what is carbon neutrality, and the debate on per capita carbon emission versus the national carbon emission. Can we move to the next slide, please? And so that's the data. And then I talk in detail about what is climatic justice. And so this figure is not in the book, but I thought it really explains, it draws attention to when we talk about climatic justice, what it means. So in talking about climate justice in terms of where the carbon emissions are the highest and where the most severe effects on climate change are felt. The tension is between these two domains. And if we look at levels of per capita consumption of fossil fuel, of electricity, oil, transportation, household goods, we get a different pattern. But if we look at the national carbon emission, then we get a different picture. Of course, as we know, the populous middle-income countries such as China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan have far more people. The population density is hugely more than any part of the world, just in these 4 countries. And they account for 40% of the global warming. So they are finger pointed as that you are producing more than 40% of the global warming is caused through the actions, the activities within these countries. But just as an example, if you look at the per capita emission, and I've given the example of India here. We could also give the example of China or any other country, from any of these countries. But within India, India is ranked third in the global in contribution to global warming, with 265 metric tons of carbon emissions being released. So through the activity that happens through construction, farming, fossil fuel burning, manufacturing, use of coal, etc., that produces this, and it's the third in the world. But if we look at per capita emission, per person emission, it's just 2 metric ton. It's 82nd in the global ranking. So Indians experience high levels of energy poverty. Villages that are labeled or are acknowledged as having electricity would not necessary that all households would have access to electricity. So there are in Indian households in rural India specifically, energy poverty is very high. So, and relationships of energy poverty with other domains of human development have been shown to be there's a very straight correlation between energy poverty and education, health, and other range and other domains. So if the country wants to progress, wants to improve its overall human development index, it has to address its energy poverty. So that's something to we can return maybe perhaps in the Q&As and see what agreements were reached at COP26, because India was flagged as one of the countries not doing much. And I've also given the example of US, but there are the example of Australia also illustrates this, that you have both high per capita and overall carbon emission that's both high. So climate justice is about support and policy based on per capita emission, and we are not about looking at the national emission. And if you look up in this graph, you'll see this is divided between fossil and land. Land refers to deforestation, etc. UK is just behind India, but the population in India is 20-fold more than UK. So this is an issue that requires engagement at a global level, understanding of the problems that I referred to, the links between energy poverty and overall human development. Next slide, please. So in the chapter, I talk about some optimism in terms of the youth activism, or the activists, the environmental activists that have sustained their efforts, some of them at the expense of their lives, and the movement has continued. The youth activism in particular is very encouraging. And that's a cause for optimism, because this youth activism is what is engaging the young people, the school children, and those who are not going to the universities or those who are not directly engaged with this topic. It's the youth that are engaging them. So that's something very positive, and that's why I've said some optimism. There is expansion of environmental pedagogy, and I've given 2 examples. These are micro examples, but there are scattered, such examples are scattered all around the world. So there is this call to engage, to connect such environmental pedagogy networks so that it has access to all school children in all countries. Joanna's internet connections from India is just an example. When you look at, you say, education, what the perils of education, those without access to internet tend to experience in a country where you have excellent growth. But there are these inequalities, and it connects really well with what Elaine was talking about. The other optimism is that in the COP26, heads of 197 countries on paper did agree to 1.5 centigrade rise. In the Paris agreement, it was 2 centigrade that they were talking about. So there is some movement, although we know that it is much watered down and much more action requires to take place. The picture in the first slide showed was very clear that although we talk about addressing inequalities within climate change, there was a whole session, yet only 4 women heads, four women were heading the key teams. So this is something that again is a call for taking forward what is in this chapter. But a key cause for concern, and this is also SDG target 4.7, which I mentioned in the chapter, that GDP continues to be driving the global national development agenda. And some very powerful voices, some influential voices in the academia are continuing to use GDP as the measurement, as the key matrix that then trickles to improvement of overall human well-being. So to me, this is of concern. So this is a call for revisiting human well-being. Are the indicators, shouldn't it be, as we did in the Sustainable Development Goals, that sustainability became the framework with which we then attach the different domains of development. So perhaps GDP too needs to be anchored within a green GDP or another concept like that. So these are areas that can be taken forward from the chapter, and that's what the chapter is about. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Meera, for talking about your chapter at a really interesting time to be sharing. All right, I see that there's some good conversations going on in the chat. I would encourage others to continue that. In the chat, we have a discussant, and then we'll have an open Q&A. So I want to invite our discussant, Anita Rampal, who's the former Dean of the Faculty of Education at Delhi University. She's also contributed to both editions of this in a kind of a unique way through interviews, which have been interesting. If you have a chance to read the interview with Anita in the second edition, you'll have a chance to see some of her reflections on that 5-year transition between editions, which is quite interesting. So I've asked Anita to join us today to help put some of the big concepts we're talking about today into context. So we've heard about sustainability and quality and privatization and inequality. So Anita, welcome, and I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Will. You'll have to tell me if the signal is okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, because like Joanna's experience, this is what we've been experiencing even in Delhi. When you suddenly become a ghost, you disappear and appear. So yes, so I'll just, 1 second. Okay, so I'll thank you very much to be a part of this panel and to have engaged with all of you through your chapters while discussing with Elaine. So that's a privilege. And I think I will start with the notion of quality, equity, and what Will was talking about, because that is something that in our own country was one of the earliest concerns in education when the country had just become free, independent. It was working with a constitutional mandate to provide free and compulsory education within 10 years, that is by 1960 of the 10 years of the Constitution. But what was found is that there was a lot of resistance from the middle classes, and there was a lot of resistance in terms of, should it be quantity and should it be quality? And I remember even at that time, the education secretary, Nayak, had written about the, education, quality, quantity, and equity, that we cannot forget equity out of this triangle. And in 64, in fact, our major education commission had then raised the whole question of quality versus privatization. I mean, equity and quality. They said, if you think you're buying quality by sending children to a private school, remember that that is jaundiced quality, or that's tainted, because you're not really ensuring equity. So the debate and the discussions have been going on for a long time. And yet what we find is that, especially, even after EFA, we were happy because we thought that we suddenly had this canvas of reimagining education. And so there was a lot of work in literacy, inspired by Paulo Freire's way of looking at reading the word and reading the world. And a lot of decentralization happened in adult education, but it also then encouraged elementary education to be looked at in terms of a campaign, in terms of people's involvement, in terms of decentralized curriculum development. But unfortunately, during the same time as the country started, it signed on the EFA declaration, and it started talking of reaching out and making education universal, it started compromising very damagingly, very problematically on equity and quality, because it started giving the poorest kind of education with para teachers and with all kinds of ways in which promoting education, which was completely stratified, so much so that now the public system, as also Joanna writes in her chapter, what is happening is that it's looked at as a ghettoized way of getting the poorest or getting the girls in an ordinary government school. But what is crucial is that the government school itself is stratified. So there are layers. There are about 7-8 kinds of government schools in Delhi itself, in the city, the capital city of Delhi. And the debates that have happened around what you said was, the entire narrowing of the quality debate, the narrowing of trying to, how do you measure quality, and the completely human capitalistic way of talking of learning outcomes is not just affecting other countries in the global south, but we find how it's affecting our system in a very damaging way. Our new policy, which came out during the COVID pandemic, is shockingly actually going back on even a fundamental right to education. It's completely contradicting a right to education which came in 2010, which actually promised every child. I mean, it was a fundamental right. So it was no longer a question of the state providing access or giving targets. It was a fundamental right from day one. But this policy now says that these restrictions are too narrow, are too difficult, the RTE restrictions. So it's going to open up everything. And in all its discourse of the learning outcomes, the focus, not just internationally. We were shocked when this term came in to the SDGs also, and when this was being pushed at the international level. But now this discourse of outcomes has become a discourse of denial, because it says, the policy says, we're not going to focus on inputs. And we know that the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised are going to be the ones who are going to be pushed out of the system. Notwithstanding all these grandstanding about universalization, and that's happening. How it's happening, I can give you a small example of, in fact, how the public system itself is being privatized in various, other ways. I mean, sort of implicit ways. So Delhi government, for instance, we are told that the Nobel Prize winning economists Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo have advised the government, on the basis of their random control trials in other countries, that the best way is to segregate children, to segregate them on the basis of ability. And this is not just making them sit separately, but more deviously, it is actually segregating the curriculum. So it's giving a diluted pedagogy and a diluted curriculum. Actually, circulars go out that you don't need to teach this from these chapters. And even in elementary school, where the right to education says that no discrimination and no competitive examination, no selection should be done. Give children an opportunity and the system take responsibility for their learning. And when the right to education came, the ministry note said that if a child fails, it's we who fail, not the child. So detaining a child is not going to help. But this system now is aggressively labeling children, segregating them, taking different exams. The examination says, even the school examination says that you are in the talented group, and the other one says that you are in the committed group. But the committed know that they're considered no good, they're considered weak. And at the earliest possible, by the time they're grade 9 or grade 10, they are pushed out. They are pushed out of the system in the thousands. They're pushed out in the national open school system. You would say, why? Because, this system is a shortcut, is a way out for everyone who is not all kinds of lakhs of schools which come under the low-cost school, or this private industry, which is the low-cost fee schools, or even the schools run by right-wing organizations, or schools which don't have the criteria to actually comply with the boards, the Central Board of Secondary Education or the state boards. So all these children are pushed into this, but that the reason is because then the state results look better. They are not tainted. So the state results become a political leverage for state governments, like is happening in Delhi, to actually flaunt these in front page advertisements on the television. And this kind of pushing out children, which has been happening before the policy, now the policy is going to legitimize. It is saying that you do standardized, centralized tests, something that we have resisted for a long time, especially the last 15 years, when the National Curriculum Framework and a more humanistic approach of focusing on the child, focusing on inequalities, diversities, saying children construct knowledge. So how is education going to be rooted in people's ways and people's knowledges? And that is going to be, that's totally being pushed aside in very aggressive testing. November 12th, in the middle of, schools have not opened. Elementary schools have not opened for more than 20 months. Only very few states have started opening now, but a national assessment survey has been conducted. So this aggressive testing being done in a centralized way is going to push children out because of these learner outcomes. These learning outcomes are low. And what happens is, as we find them right now doing them at class 8, class 9, they're pushed into vocational education. So this entire, the outcomes discourse affects children right through their entire journey of education. It pushes them out, it doesn't give them a chance, and it then pushes them into a very skill-based, a very poor system, which has been designed by the industry. There's nothing called education in that. And this now, the new policy is saying they're going to bring in at grade 8. Earlier, it was grade 10. So I'm just saying how this entire distortion of the quality discourse, the entire learning outcome focus is going to affect large systems in the South, and systems which are being flaunted as doing very well, and a lot of resources being put in, but that's because they're segregating and they're dividing. And also they're bringing in a focus on foundational learning, literacy and numeracy. So there's a dumbing down, because this is only going to be the ghettoized public system. The private system doesn't believe in looking at these curricula. You can have one curriculum, but the books they prescribe have all kinds of stuff which children are made to memorize and regurgitate during their exams. And so this entire system is being thrown away from the kind of hope and the struggles that the last 15, 20 years have seen. I would also like to say that another area that you spoke of in terms of environmental education, I think that's very crucial. Having worked in ESD myself with across different sectors, I have seen that the entire perspective is different. It's not just that you make education compulsory, you make environment compulsory. We've been through this. We've actually, in the new curriculum in 2005, we opposed having a different subject and said it must be integrated. And we did it when we designed textbooks at the elementary level, at the primary level. How does ecological justice define what you're doing, whether you're doing mathematics or you're doing language or you're doing anything else? So we had tried that, and we brought in looking at the world, looking at notions of the sea or the forest through the eyes and perspectives of people who live by the earth, you know, not just bringing in definitions from the urban divide in our country. But we find that this is crucial because, for instance, the language of the North talks about less consumption. But when I'm working with teachers in Switzerland, for instance, and comparing these perspectives, we find that in our case, it's actually a question of survival, of life and death. So it's not just consumption. So how do you bring these diverse perspectives, which are inequitous, but how do you bring them and how do you inform ESD, which then doesn't just go by the way it's looking at right now. Because even now, I totally agree that this youth voice and the youth agency brings us great hope. But even that right now speaks, I mean, the slogans and the language is still of the privileged. And whereas in climate justice and ecological justice, we know how caste is an intersection, which is playing a role and which is devastating communities, and nothing is really said about it. I'll also come to the notion of, so in vocational education, we have had a humanist legacy from the Gandhian philosophy, the Gandhian school system, where work and education, it's an integrated way of looking at education and work for everyone. I look at it as as something that offers a democratic school, democratic education. I've been talking to Kerala, which is a state which in the last 5 years before COVID, has seen about 950,000 students coming in from the private sector into public schools because they have been running a program of renewal and rejuvenation of the public system. But I think that this way of looking at democratic education, when children run schools, children have a say in actually running and managing large parts of the school, whether it's building something in the school, it's doing the woodwork for the school, it's maintaining data sources for the community, it's looking at the environment and actually monitoring environment. I mean, students play a role like our system of Nai Talim had done, where it's education for life, from life, and it's very closely linked to the community life. And I think this is where we are trying to, in some ways, pitch in and wherever, if a government system like the Kerala system is trying to look at how we integrate work and education, this is something that we are trying to achieve. And one more thing that is very worrying is that this entire thrust on online education, I mean, under the garb of, under the isolation of COVID, one very devastating thing that's happened is that the government system has abandoned offline children, these children who had no connectivity, no devices. So they are completely abandoned. Surveys done in different states have shown us how 90% of them were completely, they had no access to any teacher, no access to any form of education. And anyway, online education is not education. It's a glorified form of some coaching or tuition. It's not education. So, but now the system, the only time our policy spoke of the pandemic was in the section on education technology, but the world over, education technology is what has, the economy may have been in a decline, but education technology has made billionaires out of service providers. And that is being pushed. At the university level, that is being pushed. People are being told, even in Delhi University, that you can bring 50% of your credits from any online course, anywhere, doesn't matter. And that has to be recognized as part of your course. So teachers are worried because not only is it going to question the quality of the course that you design and you run, but it's also going to decide teachers' workload and teachers recruitment, because now if you accept that any online education is acceptable in doing whatever course you're doing, teachers are not required. You can cut down on teachers. So then, and plus teacher education is being pushed. There's a World Bank project called STARS, which is pushing even Kerala and Himachal, our two better provision states, to do their teacher education through modules online. And they're calling it choice. They're calling it customized, individualized teacher training. So this entire market and commercialization, and a lot of these apps are private apps, are coming in under the garb of looking at strengthening digital divides. In fact, there was a state which invited us for a meeting, and I thought they were talking of equity, but they were only talking of the digital divide and digital equity. So this is something we've earlier resisted and struggled against large sort of computer industries for some decades. But now I think this is just taking away any sort of work that has happened in humanistic education, and this is something we must all resist. So in terms of the international resistance and international solidarity, I look at these things. I look at digital justice as one important area, because the algorithms, the surveillance, the new research that is happening, which is so invasive in China or USA, in terms of the brain research, which is actually invasive, and putting headbands onto children and monitoring their attentions. Assessments, all our assessments are going to be customized and done through adaptive assessment, which is using artificial intelligence algorithms, which are biased, and we know the problems in that. So I would like this one area being taken up, as of course the entire area of learning assessments. I think we have, Will, as his chapter has critiqued, the narrowing down of how learning outcomes is done, but we need an alternative voice in how assessment for learning can be done. And I think we need to really work in those areas, showing the alternatives so that we can struggle against this. And lastly, like I said, the voice of the South, we don't find much equity. I mean, we don't publish much in international journals. So when you look up things about countries like ours, you find the neoliberal voice coming through. It's just the same people, the same publishing, but you find much more, and you don't find the critiques. Similarly, acknowledging, I mean, because we spend more of our time either writing in another language or in trying to write in popular, freely accessible media. And so even the way some of our work gets acknowledged is problematic. And I think that is something that the international development community will really need to take a little more seriously and see, how do you really get the authentic voice? How do you get the authentic concerns from the ground? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Anita, for giving us that contextualized example of some of these things going on within India now, and some of the future pressing concerns we should pay attention to. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I know we've already got some good questions going on in the chat, and the chat seems to be going quite lively. I want to take a little bit of time to see if there are other questions that have emerged. So if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand and share with us. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, so we can see each other a bit. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to jump in. Anita, I know you've been busy presenting, but I know that we've got a couple of questions for you as well. So while everybody's thinking of those, there are other questions. Got a question from Meera. Meera, do you want to share your question on the RCT with Anita?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the question. Could you tell me?
Yeah, I had asked, and actually Elaine kind of answered it. So I had asked that this policy, the RCT influence policy, seems so damaging. And in the wake that RCTs are being criticized, they are being critiqued, that is it how appropriate it is within international or global development. Even the medical community, where the original conception comes from, they themselves are critiquing it. And at this juncture, we are imposing it on children with the future, the long term, with long-term adverse impact. So I was just wondering, hasn't there been a pushback? I mean, sort of, where is the vibrant civil society in India? Why wasn't there a pushback? And Delhi government prides itself in improving the public schools. I think the current chief minister was re-elected on this claim that he improved the public schools, the government schools are offering. So I was just wondering, wasn't there a pushback, a discourse, debate, or anything?
Unfortunately not. In fact, that's the tragedy. The Delhi government gets away because it's looked at as the alternative to the more aggressive right wing, even though they are no less right now, their Hindutva and the way they are brandishing, the Ram Puja and all that, and Desh Bhakti, all this patriotism is as damaging, but they're getting away because of this. But it's been so damaging because even at the planning commission, I was once in the planning commission steering committee where studies had been presented, Muralidharan study, where he was the only one who was called for his research, and he came and said, we have seen that it doesn't matter what qualifications teachers might have. It doesn't affect achievement. It doesn't matter whether children have textbooks or not. It doesn't affect their learning outcomes. And we made such a noise because at that time, the right to education had just come in. And we said, we don't want such motivated researchers to be brought in to tell us that it doesn't matter what teachers' qualifications are. But this is the state, I mean, these are the people in the international community whose research on India gets more publicized. And unfortunately, as I said, Delhi government just patted itself and said, well, after the Nobel Prize, well, you see, we are doing what we were told by the Nobel winners. And nothing, there was hardly any academic sort of debate around this.
Wow, that's frightening. Thanks,
Extremely
Anita.
disheartening. I think this is.
Yeah, I mean, violating children's rights in that way. I have seen children dropping out of school because they said that when they go to drink water, even their friends are not talking to them because now they've been put in these slow learner sections. So, I mean, it's just shocking what is happening. I've just been fighting and helping with the media take up the case of a girl who was not told that she has got a compartment in class 10. She can reappear. She was told to join the open school. And when she passed that and came back during the COVID to her school, they don't give her admission. So, I mean, they're just throwing out children from the schools. And then they're saying that, look, and then they are affiliating 20 government schools to the International Baccalaureate, if you please. They've spent 101 crore they've kept as affiliation for these 20 plus 10 schools, which are now going to be under a new board called the Delhi board, affiliated to the International Baccalaureate. So, just look at this idea of stratification and privatization that is coming in a government system, which is then being, touted as something which is really spending a lot of money on children. So I would like the international community to actually look at some of these things, because what you get when you search anything from India is actually just the Asar report or something from Azim Premji or, these large corporate NGOs, and you don't actually get the counter voice of what really is happening and what we are resisting in the humanistic domain.
Excellent. Thank you. I can see one more question for Anita from Andy. Andy, I think you're still here. So let's take this question, and then if people have closing remarks, we can do that. So Andy, go ahead. Andy, you're really quiet on your end.
Is that better?
There, that's much better.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks very much, Anita. That was gripping. My question is related very much to the one you just discussed, which is relationship between the international attention to some of the RCT-based research, and in particular the teaching at the right level, and whether there is a link between the very high profile that teaching at the right level TAL has now achieved, and the belief in the importance of the right level for systems and for selectivity, for selection of children.
Exactly. You know, the entire efficiency discourse runs through the way these systems are being run, and they have informed our policy. And it's important that we get together to question this, because I'm surprised that teaching at the right level has reached international circles. I mean, I'm really shocked how this happens, because it comes through the people who are involved in the learning metrics, they are involved in the learning outcomes, they are involved in the ASA reports, and that is what reaches the international community. So I think that we need to unravel some of these things a little seriously, a little intensively.
Yeah, thank you very much. It'd be interesting to see if there is anybody working on this and able to draw links, you know, at a documentary level between some of the research of the teaching at the right level and some of the policy implications within, for example, Delhi government education policy.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
I can see one hand up, and then I think we need to wrap it up. So Layla, thanks for joining. Come on in.
Thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed all the presentations, and Anita, I really completely agree with you. So this is in no way a disagreement with you. I completely agree. I just felt that the emphasis on international community to come and look into, the authentic voices. I agree that they need to expand how they look at the reports and whose voices get picked up more often and which voices don't get. So that's completely, I agree with you. At the same time, when we say international community, we are really assuming Western actors based in donor countries. So right? So, okay. So I just wanted to make sure that you don't mean mainly.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And the other thing, Anita, I also wanted to say that many of the actors who are based in the northern universities, Western universities, and have an interest in India, quite often, I mean, there is a tendency to go and pick up voices and talk about the victimhood, right? But not really pick up on real grassroots resistance movements who are actually fighting their battles for themselves, and do tell us that they don't want to be subject of randomized control from the donor communities, but actually reverse the gaze on the, here and fight against, battle against our policies, foreign policies, or kind of donor-centric policies here, and take up the battle. So they don't want saviorism, but they want to reverse the case. What is the elite complicity in sustaining the status quo that maintains the displacement on the first place?
I know, absolutely. But I'm talking of solidarities. What kind of solidarities do we have? I'm talking of what does international education and development mean for me? I was telling Elaine that when we were having an interview, our best students and teachers were being put in jail, for fighting against commercialization, for talking about citizenship, not on the basis of religion. I mean, they were literally, so I was saying, what does, for me, an international community means that why don't people speak up and sort of, why doesn't that voice reach out, and why don't people make an effort really to support human rights here rather than only talking about what's happening in learning outcomes?
Yeah, I completely with you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna see if either Tristan or Elaine would like to say anything as we wrap up here. As our editors, I appreciate everybody coming out to our book launch today. Tristan, Elaine, you want to jump in and say any closing remarks on the book?
Well, nothing really other than to say what a fantastic discussion at the end there. Thank you so much, Anita, for launching those and for putting in context some of the theoretical and global issues that are dealt with in the book. So that was really invigorating. Thank you. And thanks to Will for organizing the.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to thank both Tristan and Elaine as the editors for inviting the authors out, but also for spending their time with us today. Meera, Joanna, Elaine, and Anita for sharing out on their experiences and their expertise and their chapters. So really appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, so we'll share out the link to that to everybody that's been registered. And you can look for that on YouTube probably later this week. So appreciate everybody's time today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, Will.